For people out there who don't know what the Analog Act is, what is the Analog Act? When was it implemented?
Anyone who hasn't heard of it, you're in good company. Even people who are lawyers, even people who are drug lawyers haven't heard of this law because it's been relatively little used over the years. And so even going back, you mentioned Nixon, it's actually helpful to start there, even though that's not when the law was passed, because under Nixon, he's the one who kind of ushered in the modern drug war era, right? It's sort of people associate with him. If you're someone who doesn't like the drug war, but maybe you don't know everything about it, you might think of Nixon as the most evil character in that story. I don't know.
That's when the like the scheduling
the Controlled Substances Act.
Controlled Substances Act, right.
Exactly. And so that happened under Nixon in the early 70s, and it did a lot of things, but for purposes of understanding the Analog Act, one of the things it did is it listed drugs on schedules. And so there's a level of severity of this drug is more dangerous than that drug, and that part of it isn't necessary to understanding the Analog Act necessarily, but the bottom line takeaway is the way you knew a drug was illegal is if it was listed on the schedules of controlled substances. It was.
And how did do you know how they determined how to schedule those drugs and how they were determined to be more dangerous than other drugs?
Sure. So it's changed a little bit over the years, but it actually involves Health and Human Services, so not necessarily the drug enforcement arm of it. And so kind of people who are more real scientists in a way, at least compared to the DEA, which is mainly drug enforcement. And so there's a multi-factor analysis that they go through looking at the potential dangerousness of a substance, and they'll make a recommendation, and that'll be a big part of it, whether they think that there's potential for a certain substance to be abused, whether nonetheless there's still some sort of medical benefit to it. And once I start saying some of the drugs that are on these schedules, you realize it makes no sense at all, because Schedule 1 is the toughest schedule, the one that has the potential for abuse and no potential medical benefit. I'm paraphrasing that there, but included among that.
So Schedule 1 is the worst.
Sure. Yeah. In the government's view, included among that are cannabis.
That's Schedule 1?
Yes. Yeah. And so Schedule 2, and just to give another example to show how kind of squirrely this is, and also to maybe kind of curb some disinformation in the process, is fentanyl. And so...
Wow.
Yes. And so there's a couple dynamics to that. I think it's useful in a couple ways. One, obviously fentanyl is much more potentially dangerous than cannabis. The fact is, cannabis doesn't have to be seen as dangerous at all.
I don't think you're going out on a limb saying that.
Yes, but another thing the reason I mentioned fentanyl is because on Schedule 2, you still have, according to the government, this potential for abuse in the same way you do for Schedule 1. The difference is, though, it also has that possible medical benefit as well. And so that might be surprising to hear for people when it comes to fentanyl, who only know it from headlines about how people are dying from it, right? But it's used in hospitals for pain relief all the time. And so that's in a very short way explaining how absurd it is, obviously, that something like cannabis is listed as more dangerous than something like fentanyl, even though fentanyl, by the way, does have more medical benefits than people might think of at first glance if they haven't thankfully needed it in a hospital or other sort of pain relief setting.
What are some other things that are Schedule 2 or Schedule even 3, like below fentanyl?
Yeah, once you get lower, you get into the stuff that you might find more in like cough medicines, things like that. And off the top of my head, I'm hesitant to say one that's incorrect, but the bottom line is not all of them make sense, to put it.
What about like meth?
Meth, that might be Schedule 2, I want to say. Because again, you're talking about something that's an amphetamine, right? And
there's controlled amphetamines that kids take every day.
Yes, and I really don't want to veer. I am not a scientist, and I don't want to veer out of my lane, and I don't pretend to be one. But again, methamphetamine, I think someone who's more knowledgeable about the science of it will tell you that there can be, similar to fentanyl, somewhat of a scare issue there too, when you look at what you're actually talking about at the end of the day. You're like, oh, this person's a meth head or something like that. Whereas if you look at the actual thing that's in it, you might know somebody, or you yourself might be taking substances that are not that different from it all of the time.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we explained the scheduling and how that all got started, and how did that parlay into this analog act?
Sure. And so if you take nothing else from our discussion about scheduling and how it doesn't make sense, at least take the fact of they're at least listed as illegal. So however stupid it is that whatever drugs are on the schedules, they're there. And so if you get arrested with them, you can't say, oh, I didn't know. Too bad, right? Those are illegal. So what people would do, though, underground chemists, is they would look at the substances that are scheduled on these lists and say, okay, well, if I'm not doing something with something that's not on this list, then I'm in the clear. So you take a look at the chemical formula, whatever it is, something like, cocaine, hydrochloride, whatever the technical chemical term for it is. And again, this is something that I'm making up by way of example. And you change it from cocaine to cocaine +1, cocaine -1, right? And that's something that's not going to be on the schedule. That's not a medical or scientific term, but just to say you're tweaking the substance just slightly enough that you're now dealing with a substance that is not that listed drug.
Okay.
And so if you can tweak this molecule ever so slightly for any type of drug that's on the Nixon-era Controlled Substance Act list, then, okay, you're in the clear, right? The government can't touch you. So that creates a problem because, okay, so in my made-up hypothetical of cocaine +1, what does the government do when cocaine +1 starts hitting the streets? You start arresting people for it or trying to, but you can't charge them. So you try and get it scheduled as quickly as possible, right? The problem is this multi-factor scheduling process can take a long time, months at least. And so that's a longer time than it takes for someone to make a new drug and for that to hit the street. So what first happened is in 1984, they had emergency scheduling, which sped up the timeline of the Nixon-era Controlled Substances Act. So basically a quicker version, so you could schedule things more quickly. Again, though, so now cocaine +1 is emergency scheduled. You can't put it out on the street anymore. You could prosecute anyone who's dealing that going forward, but you can't get someone retroactively. So the person who was one step ahead of you to start, they'll always stay one step ahead of you, even if you can get that drug scheduled and off the street. So that's where the Analog Act comes in because, so you're in...
No, I was going to say when you say retroactively, you mean that like if they create something and then later they create a law, you can't charge them for it.
Exactly. Right. That's a basic, and again, that kind of goes back to the due process point that I mentioned earlier. If for us to order our lives around the law as someone might want to do, we need to know what the law is if we're to have a fair shot at abiding by it. So again, today, if you go and get a kilo of coke and you get arrested, that's your problem, right? But again, in this made-up example, say you know the guy who's got this sweet, this cocaine +1, which isn't scheduled yet. You get a kilo of that, the cops can't touch you. But then once they go and make that illegal, once they schedule it, they can't then go back and say, look, this guy once had something that is now illegal, because that's just not a world that we can live in. But that kind of is a world that we live in now under the Analog Act. Okay. So I'll do a brief refresher. You have the Nixon-era Controlled Substances Act. That had a list of what's illegal. Then you had in 1984 the Emergency Scheduling Law, which was a beefed up timeline of the Controlled Substances Act. So still, it's only forward looking. It's only stuff's illegal once it's on the list, but you could get stuff on the list more quickly.
What makes it faster?
There's just less of a bureaucracy involved. It's more power.
Less people need to be involved.
Yeah, it's centering more power, and this is something that happened more and more over time within the DEA itself. So less from the actual health authorities, more to the cops.
Got it.
And so, okay, so now we're in 1984. We just got this beefed up scheduling law. The lawmakers and DEA are happier about that. They can do scheduling actions more quickly. But you still have this problem of the Danny example where this little punk still got away with that cocaine +1 because it wasn't scheduled yet at the time.
Right.
So what do you do to get around that? Because you can't make things illegal going backwards, right? Or else we just can't live in a society that way. So that's where the Analog Act comes in, which wound up passing in 1986, 2 years after the Emergency Scheduling Law. And so what that law says is the main term that you want to remember is substantially similar. It says if you have a drug that's substantially similar to one that's already on the list of illegal substances, you're on the hook as if you were selling that illegal drug. So I'll explain that going with our made-up cocaine plus one example. So you have cocaine that's on the schedule. You have cocaine plus one that you're making in your garage that's not scheduled. Now, you get busted with a kilo of cocaine plus one after the Analog Act is passed. Even if it's not on the list, if the DEA and prosecutors can prove, and by prove I mean convince a jury that doesn't have scientific expertise, that cocaine plus one is substantially similar to cocaine, then you've basically just been selling cocaine, my friend. You're on the hook as if it was cocaine, because cocaine plus one is substantially similar to cocaine under the Analog Act, or that's what the government would want to prove in order to be able to prosecute you.
Got it. So it's sort of just like a big drag net to catch all the people that are trying to use chemistry to sort of evade these scheduled substances.
It's bigger than big. It's infinite, because
it's infinite.
It's only limited by the things that we can create. So it's limited, I guess, necessarily in the sense that our minds are, right, and the things that we can do. But it outlaws a theoretically infinite number of substances. Anything that a prosecutor can convince a jury is substantially similar to a drug that's on the schedules. Okay, in reality, obviously, if you're holding a pencil, you know, you would think you're probably okay. That's not going to be substantially similar to heroin, right? But once you get closer and closer and closer, it starts to get a little trickier. And in any event, the phrase substantially similar is not a scientific term. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that I could emphasize, because when the Justice Department was pushing Congress to pass the Analog Act, it gave, at the very least, a strong impression that this was something that came from the lab, so to speak, that this was this term of science. And if you don't know anything about science, as I don't know what you know, but you could be forgiven for thinking maybe that is some kind of technical term, right? And I don't know exactly where they got it from. I have some guesses, because the term has actually been used elsewhere in the law, not in criminal law, as far as I'm aware, but, for example, in copyright law for a long time, that would be one of the tests that was used. Is the song substantially similar to this other part of the song such that you're copying it? And it's been elsewhere in the law too. So I've had sort of a theory that I haven't confirmed one or the other, that the Justice Department lawyers at the time maybe borrowed that from either copyright law or some other part of civil law where that term had been used. So it wasn't necessarily introducing a new term into law, but as far as I know, it was introducing a new term into criminal law, and it was introducing it in a way that sort of acted scientific, but really wasn't. Because if you ask any scientist, even with the DEA, at least now, after the Analog Act has been passed, when they've testified in these cases, whatever else they'll say, they'll concede that substantially similar is not a scientific term. So it could basically mean whatever they can get it to mean.